Marriage and the birth rate. So, sometime in the past, I'm not exactly sure when it was, a guy accused me of wanting people to be miserable and alone. And it was because I said something about how the marriage rates were dropping, which is a fact and has nothing to do with anything I want. It has to do with what other people want and what they decided to do. But I found it interesting that he said that. And, I responded just as I just told you. But, if somebody were to ask me, what do I want? excuse me, concerning the marriage rate and the birth rate, I want people to make healthy choices for themselves. And if that includes marriage and kids, wonderful. And if it doesn't, wonderful. And somebody might say, well, what if the marriage rate and the birth rate drops really, really low? What if hardly anyone is getting married and having kids? My response to that would be, great. That means the people that are getting married really want to be married. And they really treasure their marriage, and they'll really work at having a healthy, effective marriage that supports and sustains both of them and gives them the best life possible. And as far as kids, the same thing applies. There was some footage of discussions in the Senate and in the House and in other places in regards to free lunch for children and whether that should be something that was accessible for everyone in America when we're talking about schools. During when we first came back from quarantine, from what I remember and what I've heard on certain news segments, there was free lunch for kids everywhere because there was an incentive to get everything back to normal, to get people back into the swing of their kids being in school and get the kids in the swing of being back in school. And they didn't want there to be any barriers, especially with all the people who had lost jobs and gone through hardships. And so for quite a while, it might have been a year or so, maybe even longer, there was free lunch in every school in America, as far as what I understand. And then there came a time when the states and the federal government said, hey, that's over. And in some places, some states, some schools, it completely ended. In other places, it did not. But if you don't value children enough to want to feed them at school, where we do have public education, so they can go to school for free, but they can't be fed there, then to me, you don't value them enough. Because food is a necessity. And sending a child to school who is hungry, that child is not going to be able to learn effectively. So to me, to pay for the school, but not to pay enough for every child to have free lunch, is doing a half job. And it means that the kids aren't valued enough. You want to see them as workers in the future, as people that you could send to war, as, products the society needs to continue, but you don't want to invest in them fully, only partly. And so if we got to a point where the birth rate was so low that the government, the states, felt they had to ensure the health, the safety, the well-being of every child and giving every potential incentive and safety net for every child, that would be a good thing. That wouldn't be a bad thing. Because right now, we're not at that point in America. And so, if the birth rate were to drop that way, I would feel it would be a good thing. Because at this point, I feel that there's too many people who feel that children are a nuisance, children are barriers, children are a lot of negative things. Now, I'm not saying that there aren't children that can be difficult to deal with and maybe even destructive, but a lot of times that comes from being in environments where their parents and their communities are struggling and there aren't the activities and the services that would help them to grow into productive, meaningful members of society. And so, once again, if the birth rate were to drop to where there were fewer kids, and that meant that every child was valued and taken care of. And, there's an old saying, that African proverb, it takes a village to raise a child. When J.D. Vance is talking about the way that we combat the high price of daycare, where daycare in some states and cities and neighborhoods is more expensive or equal to a mortgage or rent, is that grandparents need to help out more. Now, I'm a grandparent and I have a full-time job. And I also have a side hustle. I did retire at one time, but my kids came back home, both my grown sons, and brought their children home. And so I had quite a few extra people in my house, up to 7 at one point, for almost 7 months. And so I had to take up that slack when they were getting back on their feet. I had to be the one who was providing everything for everybody that was in my house. And now that my sons are back on their feet and back on their own, I'm kind of digging myself out of that financial hole, which as a parent, that's what you do. You do what needs to be done. But the point is to just assume that grandparents have the time, the energy, the health, the inclination to do that, rather than have a program where the government's going to take care of that, where there's some funding somewhere or some incentive for businesses to pay their workers a better wage instead of lining their own pockets as a CEO. That's a problem. And if the birth rate solves that, so be it. May you walk in synergy.